Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 21st of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson, and we're delighted to be joined today by Alex Thomson with Eastern Approaches, and of course, Alex speaking from the depths of the Netherlands. Also like to give a welcome to our overseas viewers and listeners. We know that your numbers are on the rise, so thank you very much for joining us. And we hope you'll find today's news particularly interesting as we delve into some really, well, I think it's increasingly dirty stuff in the UK deep state.
Absolutely. We're going to start off with this website, Bella Caledonia. Now, this is a pro-Scottish independence website. They have an article here called SCL, a very British coup, published a day or two ago. Can't criticise it at all, really. Fantastic piece of research. They're talking about Cambridge Analytica, of course, and Cambridge Analytica is, well, a paper subsidiary of SCL. This is really at the heart of the British establishment. It's written by Liam O'Hare, and he is basically he begins by asking, is Donald Trump responsible for hiring this group of people, making the point that in fact Cambridge Analytica came into his campaign through Steve Bannon, the Mercers and some other people. They'd come to the Trump campaign from the Ted Cruz campaign previously. They make the point, they then ask the question, is perhaps Facebook is responsible for this instead? And they say that, well, basically neither of these people is actually responsible for what's going on here, and that it would be a diversion to be looking in those directions. I mean, we know what Facebook is in any case, but he then takes a pretty close look at SCL, makes the point that the board is mostly made up of an array of lords, Tory donors, ex-British Army officers, defence contractors. So this goes right to the heart of the British establishment, and he's drawing parallels with or the fact that SCL has a contract with the US State Department to counter terrorist propaganda and disinformation. But if you look a bit closer, you find that they're participating in countering Russian, what's described as Russian propaganda operations for NATO in support of Ukraine and so on. So this is a pretty dirty sort of organization, and a fantastic article pulling together the various pieces of the deep state. They mention Geoffrey Patty, the defence secretary, one of the defence secretaries in Margaret Thatcher's government. The British military and royal establishment links to SCL are further highlighted, they say, by another director, Rear Admiral John Tolhurst, a former assistant director of naval warfare in the Ministry of Defence and aide-de-camp to the Queen. And so it goes on. So I do recommend this article. But Alex, this issue, this situation of Cambridge Analytica, it's being a subsidiary of SCL and various other organisations, and the very close links to the so-called deep state. Really, this is something that we need to get the lid off.
Yes, Mike. When parent companies have got acronymic names like SCL, even if it's a shortening of a previous name, then you know you're onto a good hiding because something's being hidden. The effect here has been Cambridge Analytica has been set up as a paper entity, and Alexander Nix, the old Etonian who's taking all the flack at the moment with the whistleblower talking in The Guardian, he's able to step back from his paper role on Cambridge Analytica, yet stay on the board at SCL. Now, one of the entities that's described in this process, as you were telling me just before I came on, was Bell Pottinger. I don't know whether you had further comments on that, but I certainly do, because they're linked in my Skripal article, the background article, which is still on the UK Column News front page. Bell Pottinger, or Lord Tim Bell as he now is, was the founder, was the brains, together with the Saatchis, but more particularly Tim Bell, the brains behind Mrs. Thatcher's, or rather the cabal behind Mrs. Thatcher's election campaigns from 79, 83 and 87, and I think 1992 as well with Major. But Bell Pottinger as a spin group is very interesting to look at because it's championed causes like Chechen separatist terrorism from London, and they may actually now be wound up, as there's a link in my piece describing this, because they've been stirring the racial pot in South Africa. they may actually bear some responsibility for the hideous developments going on in South Africa for political gain. So I'm afraid, again, the analysis coming out of the usual the usual crowd who know the most about Westminster and hate it. So left-wing American analysts, for example, Irish nationalists, in this case Scottish nationalists. These people, yes, they've got an axe to grind, and they may have blind spots about their own political problems at home in each case, but they are indubitably right about a cabal of lordships and royal and military hangers-on with a plan to continue to rule the world through soft and cultural means. That is very much the theme of this year, Mike, I think.
Absolutely, and yes, you're right. Bell Pottinger is mentioned. He points out that Mark Turnbull, who heads up SCL Election subsidiary, spent 18 years with Bell Pottinger. He headed up a PR campaign for Bell Pottinger in Iraq, which included, according to this author, the production of fake Al-Qaeda videos. So this is very much something that we've seen the UK involved with in Syria as well. And it's interesting that Bell Pottinger is mentioned in this. They also point out, by the way, that of course SCL is headed up by Nigel Oakes, who has himself been associated with the royal family by the fact that I think he was either at least living with or engaged to somebody that one of the minor royals. So it's a pretty dirty picture that's being built.
Very dirty. And I think we're now starting to get some really good glimpses as to what they've been up to. Yes. There's more coming out.
Now, of course, a big part of this whole argument has been the issue of data collection through Facebook and profiling of individuals. So we thought we'd mention this article from a few days ago from the Register. NHS Digital heads accused of being suppliers, not custodians of UK patient data. This is a meeting of one of the select committees. So the heads of the digital arm, according to this article, of the UK's National Health Service have been accused of acting as suppliers rather than guardians of the data belonging to patients under the care by handing address information to the Home Office for Immigration Enforcement. So the point is there's lots of data sharing building up within the UK government and within the NHS. Now it was Sarah Woolston, who's the head of the Select Committee, wrote to the NHS Digital in January to ask it to put an immediate stop to the agreement for data sharing, saying that there were concerns about there being inadequate consultation. The NHS said it was going to continue sharing data, so they were brought up in front of the Select Committee. Woolston said, in other words, you see yourselves as suppliers of data rather than custodians of data, and I think this cuts to the heart of the issue. And the NHS Digital representative admitted that they hold 66 million patient records and said that patient data is a national asset. And so this is really how patients and patient data are being viewed, Brian. And it seems to me that as we look at this, the NHS has been turned from being something which is there supposedly to provide healthcare for people into merely a data gathering organisation. And I then question how much of the NHS budget is going in this direction.
Well, I would guess a large amount, Mike, but the NHS was there to serve us. Is it there to serve us still? That's highly questionable. The other issue, which we'll come on to in a minute, is privatisation.
Absolutely, but the big question has to be asked with the forthcoming data protection rules. These are coming in the next month or two from the European Union, and the British government has already said that these new data protection rules will apply to Britain following Brexit. Well, one of the things that small businesses and medium-sized businesses are being told at the moment is that they are required, if they hold any data on anybody, they are required under this legislation to re-engage with the people that own the data that they hold, if it's an email address or a telephone number or even a postal address, and reconfirm permission to hold that data. Now, can you imagine what effect that is going to have on an organisation the size of the NHS? And my question then is the NHS going to be exempt from this? I don't see how they can be. I also don't see how the Information Commissioner could possibly, enforce this with an organisation the size of the NHS. It's a pretty difficult situation. It looks like there are potentially going to be double standards applied.
A very interesting question, Mike, and perhaps we can see what some of our speakers at the NHS conference on the 12th have to say. More on that. But let's have a look at this. This particular journalist, Laura Kuenssberg from the BBC, getting very, very excited that the government has magicked up a pot of money for a big NHS pay deal. So here she is, NHS pay deals set to be signed off. I'm told that when it comes to the NHS, ministers plan to do that with taxpayers' money, with a pay deal for the NHS staff in England that could mean more than 4 billion over the next 3 years. So 4 billion suddenly popped up in an NHS pay deal. More than 1 million staff, including nurses, porters, paramedics, could expect average increases of about 6%. So this isn't the usual, we'll find a couple of percent to keep people happy. This is major sums of money coming forward into the NHS at this remarkable time of transformation in the NHS. The idea is the lowest pay will get the biggest hikes, with those on the lowest wages receiving the most significant rises. For example, a porter's salary could rise from 15,000 to 19,000. Where's all the money coming from? Well, it's coming from the Treasury rather than out of existing NHS budgets. So we've got this money magicked up at this critical time. I couldn't resist going to have a look at this lady's website, Twitter page. And there was a tweet here about the urgent question on NHS pay, so I decided to have my sixpenneth worth. I said, as usual, BBC News and BBC Laura either missing the point or part of government propaganda. The NHS pay deal is to keep NHS staff quiet as the last of the privatisation plans are put in place. More money magicked that should be from the Treasury, but public told we're broke. Problem is not money for the NHS, but privatisation. And stand by that one, Mike, because...
Well, that is a good point. And what I was going to ask you is, do you think this is about bringing NHS salaries more in line with private sector pay grades? Or
could be. I'm going to stick with the fact that they know there's a lot of trouble brewing in the NHS as people see the NHS collapse from the inside. So what have you got to do? You've got to try and bribe your way out of that. So there's no money for anything, education, defence, roads, but all of a sudden, bang, the Treasury's got money, presumably created from nothing.
We know that Jersey is a tax haven. It looks like Guernsey is to be a suicide haven. Here we go. The Mirror says Guernsey set to become the first place in the British Isles to have a suicide clinic. The move could pave the way, they say, for those from the UK mainland to travel to Guernsey to receive help to commit suicide. A vote to allow terminally ill people to end their lives on the Channel Island is likely to be taken by politicians in May. It's going to be followed up with an 18-month sort of consultation period when they decide on the actual framework for this. They say that they are going to offer this to people that have only, at minimum 6 months to live, or maximum 6 months to live, and people who are mentally capable of looking after their own affairs. Guernsey's Chief Minister, Gavin St Piers, said this is about giving people choice and a sense that they have some control themselves rather than being frightened out of control in the hands of others. That for me is why it's such an important issue. I've personal experience of my father who died 9 years ago. His death from cardiovascular disease was very distressing. It's not a comfortable death, and it's also not the death that he would have chosen for himself had he had the choice. So, as I say, an 18-month consultation period. And the Mirror goes on to say that, at present, anybody from the UK wanting to go over to Dignitas in Switzerland, for example, is going to be it's going to be costing them about £10,000 to do that. So we're going to create a new form of tourism to Guernsey instead.
Yeah, wonderful stuff, or not. And that brings us in nicely to our conference, Dying for Good Health. I'm going to say we are going to need a lot of help from our subscribers and supporters to bring in people to this conference. We've been asked repeatedly whether we would help set up a conference on the NHS. We've done that. Tickets are available through the UK Column website. You can go to this box here. And I'm delighted today just to give you an initial overview of some of the speakers. We've got Dr. Lucy Reynolds, We've got Dr. Yusuf El-Gingahi. Now, he's produced a book, 10 Ways to Destroy the NHS. These are really dynamic speakers. Dr. Bob Gill. We've got another lady, Dr. Sarah Gingoli. We've got Patrick Quanton, that will be known to some of our viewers. We've got Dr. Jacqueline Lang. We've got Dr. Graham Downing, and we've got a Dr. Mark Jones. Photo will come of him shortly. You can look up some of these, you can look up all the names on the internet, and amongst these people, just a wealth of knowledge, but these are the people brave enough to speak out. So please do help support this conference, and we'd also like to ask people to help us advertise it. So can we get this information out into the many groups who are desperately worried about the state of the NHS at the moment?
What's next?
It's okay. We come straight in here with Alex, I think, on Irish border issues.
Okay, so Alex, this is the BBC. Swedish expert offers post-Brexit Irish border solution, and the article says Lars Carlson, a former senior officer at in Swedish Customs, was giving evidence to the Commons Brexit Committee. Mr. Carlson said that for a smart border to work, there would need to be a comprehensive trusted trader scheme which covered small businesses. For companies which are not part of a trusted trader scheme, Mr. Carlson suggested their goods could be inspected at facilities away from the border. He also suggested there would also have to be mobile cross-border controls to tackle smuggling. He used the example of Sweden and Norway, where there are cross-border intervention zones. He said it was also a political issue to decide on the level of risk management required at each border. And he said it doesn't have to be gates, it doesn't have to be number plate readers, it doesn't have to be CCTV readers. It's up to both sides to decide on the security level. So Alex, we should remember, of course, that the UK and Ireland had an agreement before we ever joined, a free trade agreement before we ever joined the EU. And you've labelled this much ado about nothing. It seems to me that there should be no problem about going back to some bilateral free trade agreement between Britain and Ireland without upsetting the rest of the European Union too much.
Absolutely, Mike. The key word in what Lars Carlson said there was political. It's a political decision. It shouldn't be allowed to be presented, as it is in the mainstream media, as a technocratic or customs issue, because there's always pitfalls in comparing situations directly between one country and another, particularly when you're talking about Northern Ireland, which has got very particular situations. But that said, there is a very close parallel with Sweden and Norway. Those countries have a common travel area, just like Britain and Ireland do. They have the usual overlapping culture and families straddling the border, and a very shared history, as has happens both sides of the Irish border. And yet one country is in NATO and not in the EU. The other is in the EU and not in NATO. That both are very strict about the neutralities of not being in either of those clubs. They have problems with mismatched tariffs on dairy products and fuel. Yet they managed to keep their long border open through all those winding lanes through what Mr. Carlson calls smart. And I think this is the non-cynical use of the word smart, simply meaning intelligent use of patrolling. Using intelligence and deciding how much political control and customs control is acceptable. Perfectly doable in the modern world. But of course, the backstop, as it's being called, the fallback option the EU is preserving of going to a hard border, is simply a cudgel to beat Britain with over its sensitivities in Northern Ireland.
I mean, if we look at the agreement that was published yesterday, the transition agreement, there's a suggestion in that that we're going to maintain some kind of sort of mini customs union and mini single market arrangement within the island of Ireland, I mean, surely that is an untenable situation, because we'll find goods being shipped through Northern Ireland into the EU to avoid whatever there is across the English Channel.
Yes, and it means a de facto return to the original policy that Mrs. May blabbed about just after the Brexit referendum result was in summer 2016, when she flew the kite. She floated the idea in Belfast and said, do you want a customs border in the Irish Sea? Well, that's what we're going to return to. A similar situation obtained here in the Netherlands on the border with Germany, because there was a municipality on the border called Tübingen, which decided to return to Germany in the 1960s, and some very cute people moved German goods, moved Dutch goods into Tübingen on day -1, and on day +1, of course, they were able to ship them out through to Germany. With no tariffs being paid. And that's a minor loophole version. But in order to avoid that being maximised, and there are existing groups in place like the Provisional IRA, which get their money out of smuggling fuel and cattle in just that way, there is definitely going to have to be a papers, please situation on the ferry to Stranraer and Liverpool within the United Kingdom, which I recently found out we had until the 50s, at the same time as police were pestering people for identity cards until that landmark case in Maida Vale in North London. There was still the issue after the Second World War that people were being checked for documents within the UK on ferries to and from Northern Ireland. So a lot of things have been slipped under the radar in the past, and they may be slipped in again if we're not careful.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, because the DUP has absolutely said under no circumstances can there be a separate constitutional arrangement between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, and therefore we cannot have a hard border in the Irish Sea. And that's their position. Now, Theresa May's government only exists because of a £1 billion bung to the DUP from the British taxpayer. And they have said that this is non-negotiable. So she's in a pretty difficult position in this area.
She is, and it's not like the old confidence and supply arrangement between, for example, John Major's government and the Ulster Unionists when they were the dominant political force in Northern Ireland. This DUP deal is a lot more fragile because it relates to private individuals or agreements between key figures, really. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. The DUP isn't the establishment Northern Ireland party in the way that the DUP was in its heyday. And there are whiffs of corruption and narrow-mindedness around it, I'm afraid to say. The DUP government, when Stormont was still functioning, almost got brought down by this scandal over the spending on pensioners' heating arrangements. So it's a very delicate arrangement, and we've got DUP figures keeping up their end of the deal by crowing for Russian blood on the 12th of March in the debate over the Skripal issue, which we'll come to later. Very atypical of them to do such things. So it's quite a metastable situation, we could say.
Yes, okay, well, let's sticking with Brexit here. You've captioned this, Dutch do their usual job of explaining Britain, and this is from a website called ECDPM. I'm not aware of them. What is this website?
They are at the European Centre for Development Policy Management, and in typical Dutch style, they call themselves a denk and do tank, a think and do tank, because it's not enough for Dutch think tanks to be thinkers. They have to be doers as well and advertise the fact. But in their usual way, they've blown the gaff because the Dutch like transparency and they don't know about British secrecy. So they're majority funded by the Dutch government, and they're talking about having seen a non-paper. We've talked about non-papers recently. Viewers may recall that that's diplomatic speak for we have no remit, but we're going to tell you to do this anyway off the books. And this non-paper has been circulated by DFID, the Department for International Development, whose name does not appear, but the Dutch say the pen holder is clearly DFID in coordination with the FCO. Note the sequence there. It's DFID pulling the wagging the tail of the FCO. Well, what are they saying? The Dutch are probably not aware that they were not supposed to talk about this, but they're talking about DFID wanting its global Britain policy, the big theme of this year in international development. And the Dutch say that with Brexit coming closer, the UK clearly intends to make a case for opt-in in domains where EU-UK international collaboration may be mutually beneficial. This includes the field of, this is Mogherini's kettle of fish here, European external relations. More indication that the British deep state, the cluster of people around SCL and all those bodies, the Bell Pottinger lobbying bandwagon, more indications that they actually very much want to be in and steering the European defence and security policy, which is why we didn't opt out when we could have done like the Danes. So well done, Dutch. I think you've delivered us a good service there by telling us what our own state is up to.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Well, just the time to bring in Putin. And we've, what did you mention there? Non-policy. I think we've got a non-article here. This is the Business Insider. And what have they got to say? Can we pop that one on
Sorry.
Okay. This is it. Some of Putin's most powerful enemies just had a day-long meeting. Here's what they need you to know. So it sounds exciting, but actually there is no substance in this article. Let's have a look at what it says. It's clear to people who have watched his rise that Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided the West is his enemy. Now it's time for us to understand him as well as he thinks he understands us. On Friday, under heavy security, some of Putin's most vocal critics gathered to explain what people in the West need to know. Putin's main weapon is propaganda. He knows how to make people into zombies. I thought that was the job of the BBC, Mike.
Well, certainly that's a job they've been doing very well.
Yes, indeed. Maybe BBC is run by Putin. And it goes on here to say the security at the New World Stages Theatre in Midtown Manhattan on Friday was quite heavy, but you'd expect that for a gathering of enemies of one of the world's most dangerous men, Putin, sponsored by the Human Rights Foundation. Now, I was curious about that because I thought this sounds a little bit George Soros in nature, but I went and had a look at it. Here we are, Human Rights Foundation. And it's remarkable because I can't really find anything on this at all, apart from a picture of the founder. Here he is. So this is Zoltan Konder. And the picture comes up with this caption, which basically just says, where are we? Human Rights Foundation funded on the 24th of October 2014 on United Nations Day by Zoltan Konder, who is a human rights defender working on the promotion and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So here's this rather nice young man who pops up. You can't seem to find anything about him. You can't seem to find who's funding him, but don't worry because he's looking out for your welfare and human rights, Mike.
Okay, fantastic.
So I'll leave our viewers and maybe those who like to do a bit of research to understand who this young man is and why clearly his organisation hates President Putin.
Well, a couple of days ago, Boris Johnson was at the Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels for the European Union, and he was there to get all the support of the European Union on the British campaign to tar Vladimir Putin with the Skripal brush. Of course, they produced a joint statement, thank you, and they produced some sanctions, 4 more people to be added to the sanctions list. But unfortunately, Jean-Claude Juncker doesn't seem to quite agree with that. He has sent his congratulations to Vladimir Putin on his re-election. He said, "I've always argued that positive relations between the EU and Russia are crucial to the security of our continent. Our objective should be to establish a cooperative pan-European security order." So that's Juncker's position. There's the letter that he sent. Well, yesterday then there was a further meeting of the National Security Council. Theresa May heading that up, and Britain has not extended any of not escalated their sanctions against Russia following Russia's reprisals for the original 23 Russians that were being sent home from the UK. So if you remember, the Russians sending home 23 British from Moscow, but they're also closing the British Council. So Theresa May told the meeting that further measures were under active consideration, that she was ready to deploy them at any time, although they're not defined as to what they might be. So there was speculation that the National Security Council would agree new measures, but that doesn't seem to have taken place. Theresa May's spokesperson said the Prime Minister reiterated that we will freeze Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life of property or property of UK nationals or residents. And led by the National Crime Agency, we will continue to bring all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites. The Prime Minister said that there were other measures the government and security officials were actively considering and stand ready to deploy them at any time. Alex, do you think this is because basically she recognises that she's been called out for the fibs that she's been telling, and really she doesn't feel she's got the ground to stand on to sort of retaliate any further at this point?
I think you're probably right there, Mike. Craig Murray continues his excellent blogging on the subject. He's got hot sources in the FCO and Porton Down still. And the thing that Crinkmurray's noticed is that there was a very unusual action on procedure, which is asking to declassify intelligence so that it can be touted to the world, which clearly happened on a Saturday out of office hours so that it could be touted on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday this weekend. And last weekend just gone, and that is extremely unusual for an action on to be done out of office hours. It means that the 24/7 staff at GCHQ or MI6, probably MI6 in this case, smells of CX to me, that they were had to be nobbled. So it allows a small cabal again to control the release of information. The supposed new information is that Russia has been pioneering new ways of assassinating people. Sometime in the last decade. It doesn't say for a decade, it's another sleight of hand. So Theresa May probably knows she's been caught out. I have three quick awards to give to people who spoke on the 12th of March when Mrs. May gave her statement to the House of Commons when she was still saying the Russians did it with no further nuancing. I think the most shameful contribution is Chris Bryant, the supposed constitutional expert and common purpose man caught with his pants down, literally. Chris Bryant in the debate said that President Putin has resorted to violence so often, including in the Beslan massacre and the Moscow theatre siege. So those Chechens who were torturing and killing children, apparently that was President Putin's fault because he sent security forces in. That's the most disgusting contribution. Then we have Johnny Mercer, the famous Plymouth MP and former serviceman, who says that Jeremy Corbyn asking whether the Russians had been contacted was, quote, the most shameful moment in the House of Commons in my time to date. And then the stupidest contribution, I think, or the most soundbitey, is Dr. Rupa Hook, sister of Connie Hook of Blue Peter fame, no less, who came out with this wonderful cliche. Can we make sure that the from Russia with cash situation does not turn into from Russia with blood? As you said at the weekend on the Sunday Wire, Mike, this was the intellectual calibre of our MPs at the moment. It's a joke to them.
Well, absolutely. And of course, the Litvinenko affair continues to rumble on. And in order to try to support their case, the British government keeps mentioning this name. Well, Litvinenko's father has been speaking to Sputnik, and he has once again suggested that, in fact, the Litvinenko murder was nothing whatsoever to do with Putin. And the article says, can you imagine the father of the late ex-Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko hugging Andrei Lugovoy, whom the British have accused of poisoning his son. This actually happened in front of the eyes of millions of Russian television viewers. A new twist in the story. During the primetime program Let People Talk on Channel 1, the major Russian federal television channel, Walter Litvinenko, father of Alexander, who was fatally poisoned in London 12 years ago, came up to Andrei Lugovoy, embraced him, and went on in detail how he watched his son die. And he laid the blame once again at the feet of Boris Berezovsky and also a couple of other British intelligence linked people. Now, this isn't the first time that he has made this statement. It began, I suppose, his comments, his public comments began in 2006 when he made a statement saying that it was absolutely Vladimir Putin that was responsible for this. But by 2012, he was reversing that position. And in February, he reported that Vladimir Putin, if you're watching this program, please forgive me. This is what he said to RT. Please forgive me for all the slander that I said and wrote about you, for all the hatred I had for you. And by May, he said he was starting this campaign against Berezovsky. He said Berezovsky pays money to some high personas up there. Everyone is covering everyone. My boy Sasha was just a card in the hands of England. I want to return to Russia and seek justice for my son's death. So he was living in Italy at the time when he was making these statements. But this continues to rumble on. I'm not quite sure, Alex, if you've got any thoughts on why he changed his mind from his original statements in 2006, whether the original 2006 statements were merely as a reaction to the loss of his son, and as time has gone on and he's discovered more about what happened there, that perhaps he's been more accurate about who was responsible for it.
There has been a whole series of anti-Kremlin guys, Mike, some of whom who were bought off by MI6 to betray Russia, or by individual officers within MI6, I could better say, who have changed their mind as time went on. One actually was Vyacheslav Zharko, a former major in the tax police, who was an MI6 informant. You'll find about this in my Skripal article on the front page of ukcolumn.org, the translation of my translation of a piece by Kommersant about this. Zharko actually saw Lugovoy's statement saying the MI6, it was all an MI6 fit-up. And even back then in 2007, he went straight to the Russian security services and said, please put me in jail, just take me away from this deadly threat of the MI6 cabal within MI6. So there's been a series of these things happening. As the Sputnik article you put on screen showed, the original suspicion with Mr. Litvinenko, who, like Berezovsky, was basically driving a bunch of MI6 officers saying you must go to war with Russia. The initial suspicion was that it was thallium poisoning, which has reared its head again in the Skripal case. Only later have the respective exotic suggestions of polonium-210 and Novichok agents come into the frame. And that, that's the point at which Britain in both cases withdrew cooperation with Russia and international bodies who have the remit and said, no, you're not getting any more information. So there's that angle. Walter Litvinenko was very distraught, as you would be, because his son apparently was being repeatedly poisoned while in hospital. And again, we have echoes of this with Skripal. Where are they? Why aren't the Russians being given consular access? Why haven't the NHS in Wiltshire seen hide nor hair of them, apparently? So there's this suggestion that people have been getting at, someone's named in that Sputnik article, who may have been getting at the victim, in this case, Mr. Litvinenko, to add to the doses of poison later on. So I think all these things play into it. But the key factor is if you go running to Putin and the FSB, even when you're out of the country, like Mr. Litvinenko Sr. was, then that indicates that you trust them more than you trust the Brits to save your skin, which should tell us a thing or two about who the nasty people are in this.
Absolutely. I just want to ask you about this issue that you've just raised there. It is correct to say that at this point, the daughter Yulia is not being given consular access. The consulate is not allowed to visit her. Is there not some kind of international law surrounding that?
One might think so, but actually consular access is more of a gentleman's agreement. There's many cases where Brits abroad are not being given consular access, even when they're not dual citizens, because if you're a dual citizen, you can be treated as if you were exclusively a citizen of the host country where you're being held or treated. But even those who are merely, in this case, Russian citizens, on paper, they ought to be given consular access, but it's quite well known, actually, that this can be withheld in politically sensitive cases. It depends on the will of people on the ground, in this case, the treating staff at whatever entity she's being treated at.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that clarification. Now let's move on to Turkey, and you've got two articles here. Erdogan, in his own words, it looks like World War III. So this is northern Syria. Our Operation Olive Branch has been mopping up terrorists in the Afrin corridor. What are the boundaries of the US and coalition forces in Syria? Syria is already coordinating its operations with Russia. So what are the coalition using their Kurdish forces for? And so it goes on. Just give us the background to this. I'm not aware of Milliyet. What type of website is this?
Milliyet is one of those that is quite sceptical about the Turkish government and felt the pressure on it. So it's more reliable than most on this. It's a national news website. It's talking about Erdogan giving an award there to doctors on Medics Day. And what he's saying is he's doing his usual tub-thumping act. He's saying, why have the Americans landed so many cargo planes, 2,000 of them full of ammunition? Why are they not stopping at the border of the Afrin corridor in northern Syria, where the Turks are shoring up the opposition? And he said, I've specifically asked Mr. Tillerson, the outgoing US Secretary of State, why are you shipping in these arms beyond the boundary? And there's not a peep in response, yet the West has set up 20 bases here. What are they for? And he goes on to speak to these medics and says two things spring to mind: attacking Turkey or attacking Iran. They probably won't use them against Russia, these bases. But he says this is already enough to indicate World War III. He probably means plans for. The Turkish actually says Üçüncü Dünya Savaşı, the Third World War. He's actually saying that. He says there is constant talk of World War III. Now we can get more indications of this from the next slide, what he's on about. He seems to have taken his refuge in extreme Islamism, but no longer of a Western-backed variety, more of a pan-Turkic type, and also swinging behind what you would call the axis of resistance of Hezbollah, Iran and Russia now, the Astana partners. because there's a lot of text there, people can freeze it, but the essence of it is, like the Russians had their Chechen problem, the Chinese have their East Turkestan or Uyghur problem in the far west of China, an increasingly radicalized bunch of people who've been stirred up by the CIA and MI6 in the past. There's a lot known about that now. These Uyghurs are some of the nastiest fighters in Syria, together with the Chechens. And here you have a couple of examples of stooge organizations of Uyghurs in exile in Istanbul being told, telling the Turkish government, either Erdogan's party people or people very close to his party, we are ready to fight to the death for Greater Turkey. And there's even suggestion that Uyghurs have been given a kind of factory, a visa mill in Istanbul that's going to turn them all into Turks overnight so that they can't be extradited to China. So again, indications that it's probably insincere, because Erdogan is the real kleptocrat and autocrat that Putin's often accused of being. The real one's Erdogan, of course. He really steals stuff from neighboring countries. But it looks like he's trying to save his skin now by swinging behind an Islamist agenda, but also pretending that he's on board with Russia's agenda as well. At least he's certainly fallen out definitively with the Anglo-Americans, which is very significant for the region.
So it's all pretty ironic, bearing in mind that much of the sort of terrorist factions that have gone into Syria through Turkey.
Yes, Erdogan's one of these characters. There's many of them in Central America in the past who know all the dirty secrets. They have the black book. General Manuel Noriega is a close parallel, a very wicked man who thought that he was, or that the Americans had a devil's bargain with him to keep the US flooded with drugs to go on to black ops projects. But he began to talk in the end. And this is why he had to be dealt with in 1989. And the same thing seems to be gearing up now for Turkey, which has long been one of the British and American deep state's key stooges for the whole world, really, and mind control projects. The Turks, again, have gone off agenda, which may be why the coup using the Gulen organization was planned last year. Gulen, of course, is the literal next-door neighbor to his Uyghur equivalent, the man whom the CIA was prepping to be the new ruler of the Turks of China. So there's plenty of evidence, I think, stacking up that that's what's going on. Erdogan is saving his skin by defecting.
Yes. Okay, quick advertisement. AV9 taking place 4th to the 7th of May in the Horwood House Hotel. Alex, you're speaking. Brian, you're speaking. Details at alternativeview.co.uk. Get along to that. There's still rooms and tickets available if you possibly can.
Okay, and well, let's come into the subject of Brexit. And of course, it's Brexit without the exit. What better place to go than the BBC? Fascinating little article here, Mike. Brexit MPs warn of multiple obstacles to EU security deal. So we're coming out, but don't forget there's going to be a security deal. This is part of it. A longer transition period after Brexit may be needed to guarantee continued security cooperation. And this is to be extended beyond December 2020. And I love this bit. In a new report, the cross-party committee welcomed efforts to replicate current ties on Europol, the European arrest warrant and data sharing, but warned of complex legal and technical barriers in the way. I think that latter part is that the public might actually wake up to the fact nothing's changing.
Yes.
So it says to replicate current ties. I think that means to have similar arrangements.
It means to have identical arrangements, Brian.
It's brilliant, isn't it? And why should people be bothered about this particular aspect? Well, of course, the moment you're looking at the police in Europe, you're actually looking largely at military structures, but we've got the European arrest warrant there. And of course, we're already highlighting how data is being misused to track and control people. We got this one, Brexit, ministers suffer nuclear defeat in the Lords. And what's going on here? Well, basically, they're saying that peers voted by 265 to 194 to insist the UK should not withdraw from the European nuclear agreement, Euratom, until a replacement deal is in place. So here we've got another classic example. We're coming out. But we're not going to come out until we've got a deal which is the same as the deal we've got while we're in.
Yes.
So it's Brexit without the exit. And it says that Euratom, an association which is legally separate from the EU, but governed by the EU's institutions. That's a fascinating situation. It's independent, but it's governed, or legally separate, but it's governed by the EU's institution. And it covers issues such as the transport of radioactive materials, including, sorry, I've lost that
including
second
those
part.
used in medical treatments or
Yes.
nuclear power stations.
Yes, nuclear power stations. So let's take a look at Euratom and what it's up to. I chose this from Horizon 2020, which is one of their partners effectively, but it said very clearly Euratom is a complementary research program for nuclear research and training. We can't come out of this because it's so important, Mike. I wonder why. Well, they go on to say this: Euratom aims to pursue nuclear research and training activities, an emphasis on continually improving nuclear safety, security, radiation protection. It's all good. It's all looking after people. And then we get down into this little section, and of course we see that what it starts to talk about is nuclear safety and waste management. And I think what they're talking about here, of course, is nuclear weapons. This is the area that David Ellis has been warning about, that at the moment we're looking at the nuclear reactors and the waste products. We're actually looking at the weaponization of this material. Alex, I'll just say it's blindingly obvious that the deep state powers in UK have no intention of letting us come out of the European, the tentacles of the European Union, and defence and security, they daren't let us go.
Yes, as the tweet from Juncker, who represents German old money, from the Luxembourg outpost of Germany, that makes clear the German old money people are quite prepared to flip and go pro-Russian and Chinese. So the EU as a structure, which looks like the Continentals trying to pull Britain in a particular direction, that really is, as it's becoming increasingly obvious, is the British deep state and the American deep state. On the particular matter of atomic energy, Euratom was envisaged back in the 50s for the same purpose as the European Coal and Steel Pact by the US agent Jean Monnet, which was deliberately to start the project by making sure that none of these essential materials for energy and independence could be produced even by the major European countries on their own, by making that a precondition of US funding to get Europe back on its feet after the war. So it's a Wall Street and City agenda. We probably won't get through many more slides, so I will say at this point, as you mentioned, the deep state, that if people go to something else on the front page of ukcolumn.org, which is the Hofstra case, the dark heart of the deep state, our podcast, they will see there the address, the last known address for Barbara Hofstra, the mother. There's a particular request from Peter Hofstra that you can send a postcard to Haxby Hall, the address on that page, where she was last known to be, because, of course, he doesn't know what's happened to her. It's all part of the same web, whether we're talking children, theft, or atomic energy in this case, all something that was conceived many decades ago in London.
Okay, thank you for that. Just very, very quickly on a couple here. Politico here saying that Britain is pulling out of the EU Defence Force. Now, this is interesting language. If you read the article, all that's happening is we're said that we're not going to lead the 1,500 strong EU battle group in 2019 because of ongoing uncertainty over Britain's withdrawal. So this is the sop to the wider public. Here are the inference is we are pulling out. But if we get into the more detailed stuff, this was a warning put out by veterans from Britain. Former Lieutenant General Jonathan Riley speaking. He says the defence component of the exit agreement shows that the Cabinet Office does not intend to regain the defence autonomy it gave away on paper in 2017. As a result of a below-radar deal reached 15 months ago, the UK will now be transitioning via a third country arrangement that provides a U-bend route for the UK to come back fully under EU authority in the future. Political commentators in academia and the media are largely yet to grasp the small print of what is really going on. By that time, it will, of course, be too late. So this is one of the retired military seeing things for what it really is. And before I just leave you with the last comment, sorry, Alex, I just wanted to jump through here, Mike, if I can, a slide, sorry. Yeah. Trying to talk and manipulate these at the same time. This is the one I just wanted to bring on screen. We were sent this image. I find it fascinating. It purports to be top Angela Merkel, Theresa May and Dalia Grybauskaitė, if I pronounced that correctly, the president of Lithuania. And the key point here is that if the image is true, at the time it was taken, East Germany was a communist country.
Well, I'm afraid the image is not true.
It's not true.
This is absolute fake news. This image has been doing the rounds.
So where has this come from?
That is what I would like to know.
Right. So what are we saying? That this is a photoshopped image?
No, we're saying that
Let's bring the other one up on the screen.
we're saying that the girl on the left-hand side of that image is Angela Merkel,
Right.
but the girl in the centre is not Theresa May, as is alleged. And in fact, if you look at the only image that we know of that exists of Theresa May from around that, when she would have been around that age,
right,
the two children look nothing like each other. So this is quite clearly faked. It's not faked in the sense that it's not a fake image, but the suggestion that the girl in the centre is Theresa May is a fake suggestion.
Right, how interesting. Well, Alex, I'll let you round off on that. We know that the warning by the defence, the senior defence people, is certainly on the button. Has there been collusion between the British government and Germany in the past? I wonder. There may have been, but it appears that this image is fake.
There was collusion in the past. The Stasi, the East German regime that Merkel was brought up in, had particular links to Sweden, and from there, with British planners as usual, it was brought back into the West. What does unite these three young ladies when they were young is that there have been strong suggestions they were all sexually interfered with, and that they may be in some sense, victims themselves of a child abusing deep state, which straddled communism and Western Europe at the time there. So even if it's fake, there has been a particular agenda in putting it together by those who are laughing behind their hats because they know more than they're letting on about how these women maybe were engineered into place, but with a hold over them, which is that all three, I think, suffered sexually. And of course, their main priority in office, even Dalia Grybauskaite, the supposed neocon leader of Lithuania, around her time in 2008, there was a massive state-sponsored paedophilia scandal in Lithuania as well, very similar to things we're seeing in Britain and Germany. So there is something deep going on there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that analysis. Well, we'll have to end there. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our viewers and listeners. And we'll end by saying, if you're not already a subscriber for UK Column, please consider subscribing and or making a donation. We can only continue to report this news and improve what we do with your financial help. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.